September 1983, and the suborbital passenger space vehicle Spindrift is embarking on what should be a fairly routine flight from Los Angeles to London, but the Spindrift never arrives. En route, it encounters a strange spatial phenomenon, a wormhole. The Spindrift passes through the wormhole and finds itself in a, well... Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. Today's retro TV review is a show which has a very special place in my heart. It's Irwin Allen's Land of the Giants. Now, in the 1970s, Irwin Allen became known as the master of disaster. He was the man behind big cinematic blockbuster feature films like The Poseidon Adventure. And he had a way of creating these big drama, explosive, special effects driven films in that era of disaster movies that was very prevalent in the 70s and still sort of lingers on these days occasionally. But in the 60s, Irwin was well known for his work on television, and during the decade he created a number of hugely well remembered science fiction shows for the American TV networks, all of which made their way over to the UK. 1964 saw the debut of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, a spin-off from the 1961 film that was also directed and written by Irwin Allen, about the massive Seaview submarine that patrolled the Earth's ocean. In 1965, we saw Irwin's second series, Lost in Space, in which the space family Robinson find themselves, well, adrift on their way to the Andromeda Galaxy to find a new home. And in 1966, Irwin Allen debuted one of his less successful series, The Time Tunnel, a rousing adventure series about two scientists in a huge underground laboratory facility who use a machine called the Time Tunnel to travel back to various points in Earth's history. All these shows had trundled along quite well, but they were coming to the end of their lifespans in 1969. Time Tunnel had flopped after one season. Lost in Space and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea were coming to the end of their runs. But Irwin launched his most ambitious and, I would say, best show in 1969. It was Land of the Giants. This is a show that appeals to me because I've always had a love of these sort of size differential dramas and stories. Giants, small people. There's something thrilling and fascinating about small people navigating a world of giants, giant furniture, giant technology, being dwarfed by these massive, huge people. And that goes back to Grimm's fairy tales, it goes back to Tom Thumb. Ant-Man is one of my favourite Marvel superheroes. Doctor Who did a serial called The Planet of Giants in 1964. And I believe there was even an episode of The Avengers in the 60s in which Patrick Macnee's steed was shrunk to small proportions. There's something thrilling about that sort of story. I don't think it's ever been done better than Land of the Giants. And we have things like Trolls now, the Troll Hunter film. And we have lots of films about giant monsters. And that's why I like giant monster things, I think, because it's this comparison between the huge, the domineering, the massive and monstrous, and small people who are trying to survive an incredible situation. And this is so well done in Land of the Giants. And I think of Irwin Allen shows, this is the only one that still bears watching today. Where some of his earlier shows drifted into the comedic and silly, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, for example, started off as quite an intense, serious espionage type series. But before long, silly rubber monsters were appearing. The Seaview has been attacked by all manner of undersea creatures. Lost in Space started out as a semi-serious sort of adventure series, but when Dr. Smith, played of course by Jonathan Harris, became a dominating figure, the series became much more comedic and the rest of the cast were pretty much sidelined. Time Tunnel had a slightly different problem. It was a great idea for a series, but I think it undermined itself a little bit because of budgetary reasons. Irwin Allen had to resort to using lots of stock footage from feature films. So inevitably, you'd have lots of episodes where the time travellers would arrive in their destination in the past. You would see lots of huge, spectacular action sequences and battle sequences. Then it would cut to a scene on a studio backlot where the two characters were attacked by three people in costumes similar to the ones worn in the clips used from films. That became a bit wearing after a while. Although Time Tunnel did have a security to it in that the series ended up where it started, it clearly didn't have the legs to run for more than one series, unfortunately. Land of the Giants, however, is different. Now, this is a show, as I said, which is very special to me. I never saw this at the time because back then ITV was split into very distinct regions and they didn't always get all the different American imports. Here in the Wales and West region, we got things like Lost in Space, we got the Time Tunnel, but Land of the Giants never really made its way here. And I think during its original spotty run throughout the networks, I saw the odd episode maybe when I was on holiday in Devon, where it was shown on the regional network down there. My chance to actually see the full series finally arrived in 1991, when Channel 4 showed it in part of their Sunday afternoon cult slot. I think they'd already done Lost in Space, and The Prisoner and Land of the Giants arrived in that slot. The series then tells the adventures of the crew and passengers of the Spindrift. There are 3 crew and 4 passengers, so clearly the company that runs the Spindrift has very, very narrow profit margins. The cast of characters are very much standard Irwin Allen figures in that there's very little character development. I mean, these sorts of shows were made to be just shown in a random order, I think, as I've said before about previous genre series. As long as you showed the first establishing episode, the network took the view you could show anything in any order. That doesn't necessarily work all that well in Land of the Giants, because the first 12 episodes were filmed. Then there was a full series pickup, and it was debuted in the autumn season in 1968-69. Unfortunately, the first 12 episodes established a certain tone for the series and the Giants, which was abandoned in later episodes. But with the mix and match of the way the episodes were screened, the tone was a little bit uneven. Now our characters arrive in this Land of the Giants and find that everything is 12 times larger than it is on Earth. Some published licensed material about the series says it's 40 times, but I reckon, looking at the episodes, it's pretty much 12 times. You have these huge, towering, fairly mute giants lumbering along, not speaking very much, which was an important feature of the early episodes. The humans, once they disembark from Spindrift, they are routinely attacked by a giant cat, giant spider. The pilot, Steve Burton, and his co-pilot, Dan Erickson, almost run over by a giant car. They realise that something terrible has happened, and throughout the incredible, really exciting first episode, really establishes the nature of the position that these people are in, the things that they have to face. Their spaceship is hidden away in a forest in a giant city, and the thrust of the series is that they're based in this forest trying to find power sources that will give them the energy to repower the ship so they can get back home to Earth. For a show made in 1968-69 and into 1970, it stands up incredibly well today visually. The visual effects are really very good. The show made very clever use of high angles to look down on the little people, low angles to look up at the giants. They made use of Dutch angles here and there, some fantastic giant-sized props, including a whole hand, which now looks a little bit fake, but this hand sort of comes in and grabs people. This is the reason the show was so expensive to make. Its budget at the time was $250,000 per episode, which is just astronomical. I think when you look at shows today, things like the Lord of the Rings show, which apparently cost something like $60 million an episode, I think Land of the Giants does a pretty good job with its resources, and you can see why it costs so much. Because if you're making a series about small people in a giant world, you have to make it convincing. Everything has to be upsized. So you get scenes with giant telephones, giant cameras, giant batteries, scissors. All sorts of props had to be manufactured for each episode for the characters to be able to manipulate and to move around on giant tables, run across giant floors. And it's all done with this very clever use of these high angles that really give you the sense of scale. In terms of the cast, I think it's a fairly typical 1960s cast of square-jawed heroes. The cast is led by Gary Conway as Captain Steve Burton. He'd previously appeared in a series called Burke's Law with Gene Barry a few years earlier. More on Gary Conway later. His co-pilot is Dan Erickson, played by Don Marshall. Interestingly, of course, to see that we have a black character in TV, in American TV in the 1960s, when that still wasn't the norm. So I think that Irwin Allen was certainly casting interestingly by bringing in a black actor. And he's very good as a foil to Steve. He's very much, as Steve is, he's an action man. And the thing about all these characters is that there is no real character development. Across the show's 51 episodes, it ran for 2 seasons, characters don't change, they don't develop, they don't learn anything very much. There's no continuity between episodes. There's no point in the episodes where somebody says, I remember when we did this, referencing back to anything earlier, because shows weren't made that way. The rest of the crew included Betty Hamilton. She was the ship's stewardess, played by Heather Young. In terms of the passengers, again, it's a mixed bunch with a lot of potential that's not always exploited in the show. Mark Wilson, played by Don Matheson, he's a businessman who's desperate to get to London to conclude this business deal. We have Valerie Scott, played by Deanna Lund, more of whom later. She's this sort of slightly ditzy socialite, party girl of the 60s, and she's just looking for a good time in London. Also on board is a young orphan boy called Barry Lockridge, played by Stefan Arngrim. He and his dog Chipper are on their way to London, and completing the complement is the show's nod towards the type of character of Dr. Smith from Lost in Space. Kurt Kasner appeared as Alexander Fitzhugh. He has secrets. He's clutching his briefcase close to his chest in the first episode. We discover why. He's a con man, confidence trickster who's on his way to conclude a deal in London. And that's as far as the characters go. Now, Fitzhugh is billed a special guest star, as Jonathan Harris was in Lost in Space. I think that was the deal in his contract. But Fitzhugh never descends into the comedic depths that scuppered Lost in Space with Dr. Smith. He has his moments of cowardice, and he's very much, the character who tries to keep away from trouble. But they never make him a figure of fun. But he is never becomes a bumbling fool, which I think is to the show's credit, because they could have followed that route of Dr. Smith and thought, well, we'll make this more comedic. Land of the Giants never does that. Land of the Giants keeps its dramatic nose held high throughout its run, really. It is dramatic. It doesn't have that sort of comedy riffing through it. And there are attempts in the first season to develop a sort of a hierarchy on this planet. The planet is very much Earth type. Everything's the same. You get the impression that the Giants' technology isn't quite on a par with Earth's. They don't seem to have space travel yet. So they're aware of the fact that these people have come from another planet, but they don't have the ability to travel in space themselves. It's a sort of, if you look at it, it's a sort of a late 1950s sort of look that the show has. It does feel slightly behind Earth in terms of its technology. It's a militaristic, fascistic sort of planet, overseen by an organisation called the Special Investigations Department, or SID, which seeks to oppress free will, and is clearly, as we see in a few episodes, trying to stop any fomenting uprising against the ruling elite on the planet. The figure of authority that we see from the SID in the first season is Inspector Kobik, played by Kevin Hagen, a regular Irwin Allen performer. He is determined to catch the little people, and he is the closest that they come to a regular villain. I don't think he appears in the second season, but he appears quite regularly in the first season. And it's a really interesting mix of exciting stories in that first season. It's generally a very well put together series with some nice pacey scripts, which really works on its USP of A Land of the Giants. You're constantly in awe of the fact that these little people are trying to survive in this world of giants. And some of the episodes are genuinely hugely exciting. The Crash is a terrific pilot episode. The second episode screen wasn't intended to be the second episode screen. It was actually made later in the block. That's called Ghost Town, where the little people stumble across what appears to be an Earth-sized village. It isn't, however. It's a model town, and they get terrorised by a giant and his bratish granddaughter. This deviates from what we've seen in the first episode, which is very atmospheric and a bit spooky, because the giants in the first episode and in some later episodes have this sort of slow, lumbering gaits. They don't talk very much. When they do, their voices are slurred. Because you would have that differential, little people their ears would respond differently to the different pitch of the voices of the giants. That was obviously abandoned because it made it dramatically difficult to write stories where the giants could interact with the humans. But there are really some superb episodes in that first season. What I particularly remember is called Terror Go Round. This is where the little people get captured by some travellers in a sort of gypsy encampment and are taken to a fairground and have to escape. Many of the episodes are about escape rescue sort of situations. In one episode, the Spindrift is captured by an escaped convict and he falls into a sort of quicksand, and the rest of them have to save the ship. And generally the episodes are sort of the stuff of adventure series of the 60s. In later episodes, they found themselves helping the giants as certain situations arose. They had to, in one particular episode, which I think is called Framed, they had to save a giant who was being framed for murder. They had to save a scientist who was at risk in another episode. And some of the episodes do sort of blur into one another. But I think generally it kept up a decent level of storytelling with this narrative of these people who were trapped and constantly, wasn't always referenced, trying to find a way back home and hoping that they would at some point be able to get back home. Characters, as I said, were fairly bland. There was little character development. You did have clashes between Steve Burton and Mark Wilson occasionally. They'd have the odd fist fight when they disagreed about things. But all in all, the series rattled along in a typical Irwin Allen fashion, but never descended into the farce that had bedeviled his earlier shows. The show was hugely successful. I will, of course, point out the iconic title sequence and theme music for both series, composed by the great John Williams, with a really superb title sequence that just characterise what the show was about. The show had 26 episodes in its first run, was a massive success, was renewed for a second series, which ran to 25 episodes. This had a new title sequence and title theme, a pacier, sort of more upbeat theme. But the show ended after its second season. The 25th episode of the second season was the last. Some of the second season episodes had more extreme sort of science fiction ideas. There was A Place Called Earth, which was a terrific episode, which harks back to the beginning of the story and presents characters, Steve and Dan, I think, with an opportunity to try and change what happens so they never actually end up on the land of the giants. There's an episode called The Clones, which is sort of self-explanatory. And one of my favourite episodes sees Steve Burton is infected by a deadly mushroom, I think, which turns him against his companions. It makes him paranoid and he doesn't trust them. And that's a terrific performance from Gary Conway in that particular episode. You do have some slightly dull episodes. Jonathan Harris turns up in a rather whimsical episode called Pay the Piper. There's an episode called The Night of Thrombeldinar, which is sort of a Halloween-y type story. The dullest episode of the series, I'm afraid, is called Giants and All That Jazz, in which Dan tries to help out a jazz musician who's fallen on hard times. So it was a mixture of sort of dull, routine dramas and some quite exciting adventures. There was a lot of action, a lot of incident. There was always lots of stuff going on, really exciting visual stuff going on. And the show was still powering along in fine form in its second season. However, the show was so expensive that the studio wanted a third series, but wanted Irwin Allen to slash the budget by a third. This was something Irwin Allen wasn't prepared to do. He wasn't prepared to compromise the particular spectacular look of the show. And so it ended after 2 seasons. Our human heroes never got back home to Earth, and they may well still be up there on the land of the giants to this day. But this is a show, if you've never seen it, it's well worth picking up. It is available on DVD. I would like to see a Blu-ray edition, but I suspect in what's called the dying days of physical media, that's not really going to happen. But if you do pick it up, I think you'll enjoy its naivety, I suppose. You know, it's an adventure story, a straightforward adventure story. It isn't interested in story arcs, character development. It's interested in its idea. It's a land of the giants, everything's huge, small people have to navigate the terrors of life on a world where everything is so much bigger than them. And that's pretty much what it is. And I just thoroughly enjoy it. And when I watched the series for the first time all the way through in 1991, I became absolutely entranced by it. To the extent that I actually joined a British fan club, which had started up at the time, and I wrote some fiction for them. And Land of the Giants, when it appeared on Channel 4 back in the early 90s, it was topping the ratings week after week with about 5 million viewers, 5.5 million viewers. This is a time when Channel 4's soap opera Brookside was extremely popular and at its height. Land of the Giants was rating higher, and it was an extremely popular show, probably because it had never had a network screening before. People knew about it and were interested in it, but this was their first chance to see it. It really is a great show. The performances by the cast are terrific. They don't have a lot to deal with in terms of character, but obviously I think it was a requirement that all the cast had to be pretty fit and healthy and athletic, because they're up and down wires, climbing through gaps in the wall and holes and running around. It's a show that kept you fit. It's a great show. And of course it did spin off quite a lot of merchandise, some of which I have. There was a series of paperback books. Here's 4 of them, which I have recollected over the years. I think I've got another one somewhere. There were 2 Land of the Giants annuals, published by World Distributors. There was a short run of Gold Key comic strips. There was a comic strip which ran for about 80 issues, I think, in the British TV 21 and Joe 90 comics in the 90s. It was a show which was quite popular. And in America, you had all the usual things. You had Viewmaster reels, you had lunchboxes. There was a lot of merchandise for this extremely merchandisable show. It's a show that I have a lot of time for. And if you've never seen it, I urge you to watch it, because it is just great adventure. It's entirely unpretentious. It's great fun. It's just a good old-fashioned 1960s, blazingly colourful adventure show. As a side issue, I was lucky enough to meet 2 members of the cast. Years ago, back when the show was hugely popular in Britain, I attended a convention, a fan convention in London, and I distinctly remember this because at the time I was working as a disc jockey in a hotel in Cardiff, and there was a fan gathering Saturday afternoon with Deanna Lund, who played Valerie Scott in the series. She'd come over to London and she was meeting some of the members of the fan group I was part of. And even though I had an engagement to do a disco in the evening, I drove all the way to London. I had lunch with the Society and Diana Lund and travelled back to Cardiff to do my disco in the evening. The energy. Round about the same time, I went on holiday to California. Holiday of a lifetime. Never again. With my then girlfriend, and I was a massive fan of Land of the Giants. And before I went, I somehow had got in touch with Gary Conway through his agent. And I think it was towards the end of our holiday, one of our hotels, I had a phone call from his agent saying that Gary would be interested in meeting. So I had a day with Gary Conway in his office in Century City in Los Angeles. Yeah, we all had moustaches like that in the 90s. And it was a really nice bloke, really nice to chat to him. And the interview appeared in a couple of issues of Starburst magazine back in 1992, I think it was. Gary, fortunately, is still alive. Unfortunately, many of the cast are no longer with us. Heather Young, who played Betty, she had a reduced presence in the second series because she was pregnant. She wasn't hugely happy with the role anyway, and I think she wanted to leave the series. Kurt Kasner passed away not long after the series was made. Don Matheson passed away a few years ago. Diana Lund passed away a few years back. So I think the only cast members who are still with us are Gary Conway, Heather Young and Stefan Arngrim, who played Barry, who went on to form a couple of sort of grunge rock bands, and he still knocks around these days. I have a lot of time for this series, a lot of love for it, and it is, if I had to sort of list my top 10 TV shows of all time, I think Land of the Giants would be there. It isn't high art. It isn't a show that had a lot to say other than look at this hour of adventure, and sometimes that's just what you need. It's a great show. It's a classic show of its era, and as I said, if you've not seen it, I urge you to track it down. I think you'll have a good time with it. So there we have it, my friends. Land of the Giants, one of my favourite fantasy shows from the 60s, my favourite Irwin Allen show, and a show which has enduring appeal to me just because of that core idea. Little people, big people. What's not to like? And although the show is a time capsule of the period it was made, it's locked in the past. But does it have to stay in the past? Is it a show that could be rebooted? Hollywood is obsessed with reimaginings and reboots and revisiting old IPs. We've already had reboots of Lost in Space. We had that fairly weak 1998 feature film starring William Hurt and Joey out of Friends. We had Netflix's 3 seasons of Lost in Space, which completely lost the charm of the original Lost in Space because the family were never actually lost in space. You know, it was well made, it looked fantastic, but it was dull. And much as we complain about Lost in Space descending into farce, this was just too po-faced. And of course, it fell victim to the usual gender flipping and role swapping that just made it more an exercise in diversity and right-onness than an adventure series. And I suspect the same would happen if Land of the Giants was to be revisited. It's right for it. Technology is there to do something incredible. You could do some extraordinary, stunning stuff visually. But I don't think it would have the heart and soul of the original. There'd be too much tampering and tinkering with the format. Steve Burton would probably become Stephanie Burton. His co-pilot Dan would become Daniela. They'd probably be in a relationship. Mark Wilson would be a horrible, toxic man. Fitzhugh would be a paedophile. And all these things would be done just to debase it and turn what was a joyous, entertaining show into another finger-wagging exercise, and I just don't think we need any more of that. So I say, leave Land of the Giants where it is in the past. It's there on DVD. As I say, I'd love a Blu-ray set, but I'm not holding my breath. Let's leave some things in the past where they belong. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you are new here, why not like and subscribe? Loads of retro stuff, and I'll just look back at some of the stuff I've already done. And if you only knew some of the stuff that I'm planning to cover in the next few months, you would be rushing to press that subscribe button. You'd be pressing that like button too. You'd very probably leave a comment too. So please join in on my journey through my world of stuff, and I'll see you soon. Till I do, keep taking that stuff.